Hello, my name's Tom Clark. Welcome everyone to the inaugural lecture, our new series of lectures dedicated to themes in global history related to pandemics. This lecture series comes from the outdoors first, and it'll move indoors soon. It's a result of our annual author summer party, which ordinarily would be outdoors, and the lectures associated with that being sadly cancelled due to COVID-19. So we're delighted to produce this digital lecture series every Thursday at 6 p.m. CET, Central European Time, for at least the next 4 weeks. We're incredibly excited to showcase such topical humanities research with explicit interest on the ongoing experience of the COVID-19 crisis. We are incredibly grateful to our authors, particularly in this ambition, and our Gruyter editorial team in the humanities, our marketing teams and our communication teams for making this event happen, which at a time of great change. Particular thanks go to Katerina, Ralph, Pablo, Vasilius, Kevin, Anya, Murto, Marco, Marcus, and Julia. But I hand over now to your chief curator, Rabea, who will introduce our first speaker. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Tom, and enjoy the outdoors. Welcome all to the first digital lecture of a lecture series called The Gruyter Corona Talks, Thinking in a State of Exception. And as Tom just said, we will have a lecture now each Thursday. And first up is Thomas Zimmer. He's assistant professor of contemporary history at Albert Ludwigs University of Freiburg. And beginning in January 21, he will be DAAD visiting professor at Georgetown University in Washington. He's the author of the book Welt ohne Krankheit, Geschichte der internationalen Gesundheitspolitik, which roughly translates to World Without Sickness, History of International Healthcare Politics, in which he explored the history of global health politics after the Second World War. And he's currently writing a history of polarization since the 1960s, aiming to historicize the idea of polarization, how it has been theorized in the social and political sciences, employed by historians, used in politics, and how it has shaped the broader political discourse. This talk derives from the essay Thomas wrote for our ebook pamphlet, 13 Perspectives on the Pandemic. Thomas, thank you so much for being our opening speaker. And we are all very much interested and very keen on what you have to say now.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to you tonight, discuss with you the history and the present of pandemics and global health. I want to keep it brief and present you with two thoughts, or rather two recurring themes, two leitmotifs, two crucial dynamics that have shaped the history of global health and the way the international community, or more precisely, the Western part of the international community, has dealt with the threat of infectious disease since the 19th century. I want to stress that analyzing this history will not lead to clear-cut policy guidelines and recommendations. History never offers these kinds of simple lessons, and we should all be wary of those who want to convince us otherwise. But I do believe that understanding the history of global health will help illuminate our current situation and the challenges we face going forward, as it provides an important frame of reference and alerts us to crucial issues and problems, to structures and dynamics. Let's start here. Diseases do not respect national borders. We've all heard variations of that phrase uttered many times over the past few months. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, politicians, experts, journalists have been articulating this fundamental reality, or what we perceive to be a fundamental reality, over and over again, often combining it with a plea for cross-border cooperation and solidarity. And yet, the responses around the globe have been distinctly national in scope and uncoordinated in character. The first impulse by almost any affected nation was to close borders and restrict travel. The European Union has struggled to come up with a concerted answer, and while few are as openly hostile towards the World Health Organization as the US President Donald Trump, Most governments seem to harbor a hefty dose of skepticism about the capabilities of the WHO to coordinate and lead the international community in the fight against COVID-19. Such tension between the realization that pathogens do not recognize political boundaries and the tendency of states to try and shut themselves off anyway has often characterized international responses to the threat of pandemics. When 12 European states sent representatives to the first International Sanitary Conference in Paris in 1851, which established public health as a matter of international diplomacy in the modern sense, they did so because they were convinced that some form of border-crossing health regime was necessary to protect the continent from plague, from yellow fever, and most importantly, from cholera. In the 19th century, cholera came to dominate the European imagination of health threats. The disease originated in South Asia and spread around the globe in several waves, starting in 1817, first reaching Europe in the early 1830s. From the start, ideas of internationalization, or as we've come to call it, globalization, and perceptions of threat from infectious disease were intertwined. The cholera pandemics were directly caused by a new quality and quantity of inter- and transnational movement of people and goods in the wake of European colonial expansion and intensified trade relations, and they were made possible by new modes of transportation. As a catalyst for ideas of the world becoming ever more interconnected, the specter of cholera gave rise to a new form of cooperation between sovereign states, and it laid the groundwork for today's global health politics. However, that collaboration has rarely been animated by or conducted in a spirit of global solidarity. And this is really the first leitmotif in the history of global health that I want to alert you to. As the reactions to cholera demonstrated, global health politics was often centered around the goal of sealing off Europe or the West from quote unquote diseased parts of the world, and of reinforcing and protecting instead of transcending national borders through quarantine measures, travel restrictions, and other such measures. And as soon as that goal was achieved, the West largely lost interest in the fight against cholera. The last major outbreaks in the West occurred in the late 19th century. Famously, the city of Hamburg in northern Germany was hit hard in the summer of 1892 when the disease killed more than 8,000 people in a matter of weeks. Ever since, however, cholera has been relegated to an afterthought in the West's imagination. Yet in a global perspective, it is still very much a massive problem. And some of the worst cholera epidemics in history occurred recently. There were roughly 700,000 cholera cases in Haiti after the devastating earthquake in 2010, and an estimated 1.7 million cases in war-torn Yemen after 2016. And yet, the reaction in the West to such mass suffering has been shockingly muted. And that points us to a second leitmotif in the history of global public health. In the West, the pendulum has swung wildly between eruptive spikes and attention for matters of global health and phases of almost complete indifference and obliviousness. The AIDS pandemic perfectly encapsulates this pattern. AIDS was first diagnosed in 1981, and the AIDS attention in the West peaked in the mid to late 1980s when it was seen as a major threat. It took a while for HIV/AIDS to be recognized as a truly global challenge. The World Health Organization didn't really make it a priority until the end of the 1980s, when it finally became clear that HIV/AIDS was not, as initially suspected, a strictly Western problem, but in fact a pandemic about to devastate the global South. However, right when WHO and the United Nations made HIV/AIDS a priority, interest in the West started to wane. By the late 80s, it was clear that Western states had pretty much contained the virus. And consequently, throughout the 1990s, the WHO struggled mightily to acquire needed funding from the wealthiest nations as the pandemic spread around the globe. Since 1981, there have been roughly 75 million HIV infections and well over 30 million deaths. And the vast majority of those have occurred in the global South and after people in the West simply stopped caring about the disease. There are many more examples for the fact that notions of acute danger from infectious disease tend to have a fairly short shelf life in the West and have not led to sustained efforts by the world's wealthiest nations. Just compare the massive attention for the 2014-15 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, which I'm pretty sure we can all, you will all remember, with the fact that Central Africa has been experiencing the second worst Ebola epidemic in recorded history since 2018, and it has barely caused a reaction. The public discourse surrounding matters of global health is fundamentally fast-paced and often oblivious in nature. There was a brief moment in the mid-20th century when it seemed like the international community would break out of this cycle of panic and neglect and answer the threat of infectious disease in a spirit of global solidarity. In the 1940s, the idea of world health momentarily came to the fore. To many contemporaneous observers, it seemed that the world was rapidly shrinking. The idea of a shrinking world is pretty much omnipresent in the mid-1940s. As Brock Chisholm, the World Health Organization's first Director General, put it, and I quote him, "Until quite recently, man's environment has been his locality only, his village or town, or at most his own country. This situation has changed entirely. The environment of every person is now the whole world." Contemporaries feared that the supposedly unprecedented level of interconnectedness in the dawning global age, quote unquote global age, was inherently dangerous, for it seemed to allow diseases to spread all over the planet with staggering speed. In the age of aviation, the US State Department warned in June 1945, I quote, "Disease travels faster than ever and becomes a threat to the highly developed countries with their vast centers of communication, even more than to remote and undeveloped regions of the world." But for once, the heightened sense of threat did not lead to demands that the healthy parts, quote unquote, healthy parts of the world cut themselves off from the rest. For if it was truly the case that diseases knew no boundaries, then no one would be safe from harm unless everyone was. The health of any individual was inextricably bound to that of every other person on Earth. And by the end of 1945, such perceptions had crystallized in the idea of a collective state of world health. As a result, quarantine measures were widely discarded as anachronistic in the 1940s, as was the general idea of shutting off the rest of the globe. As General James Simmons of the US Army Medical Corps told Congress, US Congress, in June 1947, I quote him, "We have passed the age when we can think in terms of isolation in connection with health and disease. For from this viewpoint, we truly live in one world." One world. That is a vision that many policymakers and health experts shared immediately after the Second World War. The world coming together as one, fighting diseases on a global scale, at the source, as they like to put it, in the name of world health. Such utopian visions sound unrealistic to us. All the more so since they were partly based on a fairly strong, and we might add somewhat misplaced, belief in new technical and biomedical superweapons. During and immediately after the Second World War, a host of technical and biomedical innovations had been introduced that were perceived as game changers in humanity's struggle with disease. There were new vaccines against tuberculosis, for instance, antibiotics like penicillin, powerful insecticides like DDT, unprecedentedly potent weapons against disease or against disease vectors, insects, that contemporaries often referred to as magic bullets. In the early 21st century, as antibiotic resistance is spreading and the world is struggling from rampant ecological damage, we have become less willing, justifiably so, I would say, to put our hopes solely in technological innovation or emulate any kind of techno-euphoria. That does not mean, however, that we should simply disqualify and dismiss these mid-century visions of world health as naive. They resulted from the diagnosis that in the dawning global age, humanity faced unprecedented health challenges, which necessitated equally unprecedented reactions if catastrophe was to be avoided. The Zeitgeist of the 1940s was extreme in the sense that there seemed to be no middle ground available. Humanity would either succeed in creating a world without disease, or it would perish. These were seen as two sides of the same coin, and both these options seemed eminently possible and basically equally plausible to most observers at the time. With early Cold War tensions brewing and perceptions of acute threat from disease soon fading in the West, such aspirations of global communion quickly receded. And by the end of the 1940s, they already felt like a dream that never was. And so the World Health Organization, founded in 1948, itself a manifestation of this vision of creating a world without disease, has never been able to make good on the promise of world health and global communion. As the WHO has featured prominently in the news for months now, it really only ever does when the West feels acutely threatened by epidemics. It's probably worth saying a few words about the organization and the widespread critique of how it has handled the latest crisis. That critique does not only come from the man in the White House. A consensus seems to have formed that the WHO's response has been disappointing. And maybe that's true. But it's also true that the WHO has only ever been and has only ever done what its member states, and crucially, what its wealthiest and most powerful member states have allowed it to be and have enabled it to do. Generally speaking, the WHO's ability to fulfill its ambitions has been hampered from the start by two main factors. First, WHO officials have always had to content themselves with vastly inadequate resources. Early on in the late 1940s, member states limited the organization's budget to a measly $5 million, US dollars. Today, its biannual budget amounts to roughly $4.5 billion. And if that sounds like a lot to you, it's really not, because that puts WHO in the same ballpark as the University Hospital of Geneva, and that is less than what some major US hospitals get to work with. Secondly, WHO's impact has been blunted by the fact that national interests have almost always overridden global health concerns. Whenever member states felt inconvenienced by WHO initiatives, they simply refused to cooperate, or they imposed strict limits on the organizations. As the United States, irked by WHO efforts to regulate the global production, marketing, and distribution of drugs and medical supplies, did in the mid-1980s or early to mid-1980s, withholding membership contributions and pushing for a permanent freeze of WHO's budget. There are instances when WHO has proven extremely effective. For example, when in the 50s through 1970s, it was responsible for planning, coordinating, and evaluating some of the most ambitious international undertakings of the Cold War era, the so-called global eradication campaigns against malaria and smallpox. For most of its existence, however, it's been desperately scratching and begging for attention and resources with, at best, mixed success, as the story of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, I think, most clearly demonstrates. Nothing encapsulates the lack of global solidarity in matters of global health and the cycle of panic and neglect more clearly than the West's relationship with the WHO. But I want to end on a hopeful note. Maybe once the immediate danger from COVID-19 is past, we can rediscover the visions that underlay the founding of the WHO and reflect on the ideas the organization was initially meant to pursue. I think recalling the vision of world health can challenge us to take a fresh look at the cyclical dynamics of crisis and oblivion that have shaped our perception of global health. And the idea that we're all together in this, that we're all in this together, that no one will be safe from harm unless everyone is, that the health of any individual is inextricably bound to that of every other person on earth. That might serve as a reminder that we need to come up with answers that are as global in scope and character as the problems we are facing, and that it is possible to imagine a way of tackling the challenges of the global age that is not focused on national, but on global solidarities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for this very interesting and fascinating talk. And thank you also very much for ending on a hopeful note. Your sentence, no one would be safe from harm unless everyone was or is my new favorite. So if you don't mind, I'd like for us to discuss a little bit about your talk. And my first question for you would be, like you said that something was different in the 1940s. There was this brief moment where the international community looked like they could work something out. And my questions would be, what was different in the 1940s that brought this change of heart on? I mean, obviously, the war and the end of the war, but was there anything else? And then also, why, after that failed, why was there never an attempt to try that again? And as a follow-up to that, was the founding of the 1970s founding of Doctors Without Borders something like a reaction to the failed institutional cooperation and the failed political solidarity?
So I really want to stress how unusual this moment in the mid-1940s was, how unusual the circumstances under which this vision of global solidarity was at all able to gain enough steam to influence international politics in any significant way, right? It was the height of internationalist or globalist sentiment, certainly in the US. There was a short window before the onset of Cold War tensions when the global dimensions of the Second World War, and particularly the advent of the nuclear bomb on the world historical stage, if you want, had really pushed this general idea of a dawning global age, of the world shrinking, of the world globalizing. That is not something that just health experts talk about. That's omnipresent in the contemporaneous discourse. And that leads to a constellation in which global solidarity was not considered to be altruistic, but in everyone's best interest. It's not global solidarity as something that we do for others because we can. It's something we have to do because in the global age is the only way to protect ourselves. It's a form of global solidarity out of self-interest, really. There's this collection of essays published by the Federation of American Scientists in 1946 that I think captures this vision or this diagnosis very precisely. It had pieces by famous physicists, by Oppenheimer and Einstein, people like that. And the title they chose for the collection was "One World or None." That's really the spirit, right? Not just, but particularly among health experts. Global solidarity or doom, or the apocalypse, or humanity perishing if it's not able to deal with the global challenges in global solidarity. So I think we should really look at these immediate post-war months as a very particular moment in the history of the 20th century, a very specific, very fleeting constellation, a window of opportunity, if you want to call it that, that quickly disappeared with the onset of the early Cold War. Now, you mentioned Doctors Without Borders, and I find that super interesting. I mean, I should say that I'm not an expert on the history of humanitarianism, which has been one of the most prolific fields of historical research in the past 20 years or so. So there are other people that know much more about this than I do. But there is something really striking when you look at Doctors Without Borders from the perspective of this 1940s vision of world health and global solidarity. So, like you said, Doctors Without Borders was founded in the early 70s, right, in the aftermath of the Nigerian Civil War, by French doctors who were disillusioned and frustrated with the way not only Western governments, but also the Red Cross and other international organizations had reacted when faced with the horrors of mass starvation and mass suffering in the Biafra region of Nigeria. Because to them, it seemed unconscionable that these organizations would just accept mass suffering, or at least choose not to do whatever possible to alleviate it out of respect for national borders, out of respect for national sovereignty, right? So in the case of the Nigerian Civil War, this idea that we cannot help the people suffering if the Nigerian government doesn't want us to. So they subscribe to a very different conception of impartiality or neutrality or of being non-political that entailed ignoring national borders and political boundaries and do whatever is necessary wherever, whenever to alleviate suffering. And in many ways, I think that is indeed very close to what some of the founders of the World Health Organization had in mind when they set up the organization to be non-political, right? So I mentioned Brock Chisholm, the first WHO's first Director General, and he said in 1946, when they were debating what the organization would be and what it should do, he said, we have to draw lines boldly across all boundaries and be undeterred by political considerations, basically, right? But of course, in practice, member states made it very clear to the WHO early on that they would not tolerate to be inconvenienced by the World Health Organization. And WHO officials learned to confine themselves to a very narrow definition of what it meant to be non-political, right? Which really translated to non-controversial health work that would always put the member states' interest first. So I think it's fair to say that the WHO, at least in, not in theory, but in practice, and Doctors Without Borders do indeed represent two very different interpretations of the same general idea of being non-political. And that's what I think makes this fascinating.
Okay, thank you. My next question is about the leitmotifs you mentioned. The one where the first one, the West basically sealing itself off from the rest of the world as soon as a crisis appears on the horizon. And the other one with the West taking notice of crisis happening elsewhere only for a very short amount of time, if at all. But is that really at all different from the treatment of global catastrophes in general? If you think of earthquakes, floods, terror attacks, civil wars happening all around the world on a daily basis, we don't care. Is that perhaps maybe nothing specifically related to health crisis, but maybe a deeper structural problem, possibly also based to a certain degree in our colonial history?
So I think generally speaking, what you're saying is spot on. Similar dynamics do not just shape our reaction to the type of events and catastrophes that you mentioned, right? They really shape the way we deal, or often do not deal, with all sorts of collective action problems, right? With matters that require collective action on an international or on a global scale, and climate change being the obvious example here, right? You mentioned the longer-term structural and cultural factors that explain these patterns, and I think you're totally right about those. It is undoubtedly true that they have created hierarchies of suffering, or hierarchies of who is and who is not considered worthy of our attention and our sympathy and our empathy, right? We should also not forget that the tendency in the West to generally ignore epidemics and other collective action problems also has to do with the fact that while those are problems that affect everyone on the globe, they do very much not affect everyone in the same way and to the same degree, right? And that's the reason I think why Western governments and Western political and societal elites have not felt the same urgency in dealing with climate change as, say, Pacific Island nations, right? This is going to become a life and death problem for us much, much later down the road. And the wealthiest nations of the planet will always be able to stave off the effects of climate change for much longer than the rest of the world. To take this back to COVID, right? Early on in the pandemic, like early March or something, I remember even some otherwise smart people who I thought were smart people, talking about how this pandemic was going to be different than others in history, in that it was supposedly going to be affecting everyone, all parts of society the same way, young and old and rich and poor, and those at the top and those at the bottom of society. That is obviously not correct, right? Epidemics exacerbate existing inequalities, and they affect those the hardest who are disadvantaged and discriminated against, always. This is nowhere more obvious than in the United States right now. If you look at the situation in the US right now, cases are spiking, the number of new infections is rising in some states to unprecedented levels. And while all that is happening, America's political elites seem to have simply given up on the pandemic. And that's not just the president, it's not just the Trump administration, it's now all about reopening, right? And it seems clear to me that this has a lot to do with the fact that the pandemic is affecting disadvantaged communities much harder, that Black people and Native Americans in particular have a dramatically higher risk of getting infected and of dying of COVID-19. And whether that's consciously or not, America's elites don't seem quite as affected by that. They don't seem quite as worried by that. And they seem quite a bit more willing to accept these groups suffering, right?
And would you say that as well? You kind of already answered that, but with the colonial history roots, would you say that plays a role at all?
I mean, colonial roots in the sense that I think there's still our sort of attention span, our empathy, the regions of the world to which we extend empathy and the regions of the world to which we do not extend empathy, that geography of attention and empathy, if you map that onto sort of, colonial empires, I think you would probably see that we're still, if something affects, parts of the world that we feel more closer to, that has a very different impact than if it just affects, the former colonies or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. So you have these sort of long-term structures, long-term hierarchies. That's definitely very much a factor. I wouldn't necessarily single out colonialism. It's an overall hierarchy of who deserves and who does not deserve our empathy and our sympathy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mentioned the like COVID-19, obviously. So it's not looking good in terms of global solidarity at the moment. But this health crisis for us, it didn't just appear out of thin air. There were very loud and clear voices warning us of the danger the virus posed, and still almost every Western country only started acting once hit with cases itself. So even when Italy and Spain went into complete lockdown, the rest of Europe and the US still kind of leaned back and watched. So why do you think it is so hard for most nations to be proactive, even when others, especially I'm thinking of New Zealand now, are so much better at preventing measures, but still we look at them, we see that they are successful in what they're doing, but we're still doing nothing. How would you explain that?
I mean, it's certainly true that many states, certainly most Western states, were late to react to the threat of COVID-19, right? This, I think, definitely had a lot to do with the virus and the disease initially being seen and construed as an Asian problem, right? Something Asian, a process that you might call the othering of the disease itself, right? It was not, for the longest time, it was not seen as something that would directly affect us. I think we should also mention that there have been many warnings over the past few years, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Sars epidemic of 2003 in particular, I mean, seen from today, looking back, looks like a massive missed opportunity, right? That was the first time a coronavirus led to severe complications in humans. It also affected Asian countries, some Asian countries most heavily, and some of those learned valuable lessons, right? They built structures of epidemiological surveillance. They established a culture of mask wearing to hinder the spread of infections, when we in the West did none of that, right? I mean, there was even a tendency until basically a few months ago to look at Asian mask culture in a derisive way, so there was this parochial impulse to discount it as something weird and foreign. Why are these people running around with masks, right? And so I think we were still when the pandemic hit, this pandemic, COVID-19 hit, we were still stuck in this cycle of panic and neglect, sometimes caring, but only ever so briefly about diseases, and then going right back to not caring all that much. Yeah. Why were some Western countries better able to respond than others? I think we would probably have to look at a bunch of different cultural and social and political factors and circumstances. But one thing seems clear. The pandemic has acted as a kind of stress test, right, for the state and for the capacity of the state, for the capacity of the political culture and society to handle challenges like these. And as we see most dramatically in the United States right now, and as we've also seen definitely in Great Britain and in other countries as well, some Western countries are obviously not able to meet that challenge right now. Very
true, yes. You mentioned earlier on, the the US system and healthcare, how big of a problem that is, especially for people not earning as much. So when, as you said, when COVID-19 hit the US, people who suffered the most were the ones who were not able to work from home all the time, stay inside, get tested or get treated. And those people were more likely to be people of color or of a minority ethnic due to the structural racism over there. So I'm going a little bit. I'm going away from your talk now a little bit to the Black Lives Matter movement, if you will. So, but Corona hitting those people the hardest might have fueled the protests after the murder of George Floyd. And when those protests start and made their way not only through one country, but through several at a very fast pace, would you say that, in a sense, that was a way of global solidarity, but maybe on a level of civil society, maybe even the early beginning of a global solidarity movement, if you will? So should we stop waiting on politicians to work together and instead start looking to us, to civil society, to do that?
So I would probably note a few things here. In order to explain the current moment, the wave of protests, the reaction to those protests around the globe, I think we have to understand how in the United States, everything has hit at once, right? So police violence against African Americans is obviously not a new thing, right? It is, as a matter of fact, one of these central leitmotifs of US history, and it has often been the catalyst or the spark for Black protests. The brutal killing of George Floyd, or rather the video of that killing, hit a society at the breaking point, right? That's how New York Times columnist Jamel Bouie put it, a society at the breaking point, a society in which the pandemic, like all pandemics, had exacerbated existing inequalities and made them more visible, right? Not just to US observers, but to observers around the world. It's also, by the way, I think, a society in which the Black Lives Matter movement has for years worked very hard. It's arguably the most successful social movement of the past 50 to 60 years. It's a testament to the tenacity of these activists, because all that has created a situation in which we now see a dramatic shift in public opinion, right? A dramatic shift in public opinion regarding police brutality, a shift in public opinion regarding the Black Lives Matter movement itself, regarding the tearing down of statues and monuments of white supremacy. It's an extremely powerful moment, and I'm going to say a hopeful one. Again, I'm gonna insist again that we look at it as somewhat of a hopeful moment. There have been comparisons, many comparisons made to the late 1960s and the race riots that shook America in the mid to late 60s. And that also, by the way, was a period that was characterized by transnational or international protest movements, right? By the student movement, of course, or the anti-Vietnam War protests. But where in the late 1960s, certainly in the US, these protests were met with disapproval by what Richard Nixon famously called the silent majority, right? And I think he was right to call it that at that time, where the white backlash politics ultimately won out. Right? What we're seeing now are protests that are much more racially diverse and that have much more support from white people, and that have even led to this wave of inter or transnational solidarity, and to people in other societies finally starting to take a look around and reconsider racial hierarchies and structures of racist discrimination. I mean, who knows what's going to happen next? If it's just a blip or truly the beginning of lasting change, I mean, I don't know, but I see reason to be hopeful.
And coming from Black Lives Matter to the famous hashtag Black in the Ivory, where basically academics talk about their experiences of everyday racism. I was wondering, when I look at the hashtag and people talking about it, it's basically people from the US, the UK and Europe, and maybe a little bit Australia. Japan, China, Korea, South Africa, not so much. Why do you think that is? Is it because those countries are not affected as much from those problems? Is it to come back to the leitmotif, something like a inversion of the second one, like the rest of the world just not caring what happens in the Western countries because it's not happening to them right now? Or is it maybe we are all the same? We are detached from everything until we are affected.
I think I would probably phrase that a little differently. Maybe spin it in a slightly different direction, because this Black in the Ivory, it's not a movement, it's a call for action, basically, right? Or it's become a call for action. It was started by African American academics who told publicly about their experiences in an environment in which Black people are dramatically underrepresented, right? These Black academics, those are people who made it in the academic world despite and against a racial caste system that makes it very hard for them to succeed. I will openly admit that I don't know anything about how this has been perceived or why it has not been perceived in other parts of the world. So you'll have to excuse my complete ignorance here. Generally though, I'd say let's look inward first, right? I mean, before we start looking at why this part or that part of the world doesn't share this concern, let's start looking inward first. It is on us as white scholars, I'm talking about myself here, right? To listen to these stories, to reflect on structures of white privilege, and to reflect on our own complicity, the ways in which we ourselves may or may not have helped perpetuate these systems and these structures, and then figure out what we can do to change that and take action. I'll say, as someone who has spent his entire professional life in the German academic system so far, we have to look around and realize how the German academia is almost entirely white. I mean, people of color, people with a migration background, almost entirely absent, right? I mean, look, that may be different from field to field somewhat. I don't know. I'm a historian. I can talk about the humanities maybe, but it's probably true, right? So again, I mean, the circumstances that have led to this moment are horrifying, right? A pandemic, the brutal killing of a Black man live on video, the police rioting, answering anti-racist protests with brutal violence. But it has led to a moment of reflection, and maybe a moment that gives us a chance to change things, right? So I'm gonna say, let's not waste the moment.
I really love your optimism and hope.
I'm not even that optimistic. I'm grasping for straws, really, right? I'm not super optimistic. I think there's reason to be a little more hopeful than I'm personally feeling. And I'm probably articulating that basically to convince myself.
Fair enough. Okay, so thank you so much for answering my questions. And now we have some questions from our audience. And I just read out the first one. This is, how has journalism reporting and documenting shaped the discourse surrounding these pandemics, and what role is journalism playing to shape our knowledge or opinion or action theories today?
Look, I think there's been a very interesting debate over how journalism should act how journalists should act in a crisis situation like this, right? So for instance, remember the debate about mask wearing in the West, where initially authorities basically told us, nah, let's not do it, right? Because the fear was, we don't have enough masks. If we tell the population, go get masks, the people who really need them, right? Doctors, we're going to run out of masks. So tell the population, you don't need masks, right? We now know that that was a mistake, right? That we know now that if we had we all started wearing masks early on, say in late February, early March, we would be in a much better place now, right? So the debate is now, should journalists have pushed back more against, authorities saying, hey, you don't need masks. How come journalists were not aware that the science around mask wearing was not clear at all, that there was a lot of uncertainty? Why did journalists not communicate the uncertainty around mask wearing more clearly? All that sort of stuff. And I think those are hard questions, right? I think what I'm going to say is, I think journalists have a tremendous responsibility to translate scientific opinion, to translate scientific debate to their audience. And let's face it, I mean, none of us, I mean, certainly not me, we're not going to sit down and read science papers and figure out the science ourselves. We need translators, right? And I think there was a moment early on in the pandemic when too many journalists stopped trying to translate and started basically just repeating what the political message was, they started repeating the messaging instead of trying to explain where the messaging came from and why it maybe was something that we should push back against. And I understand that. I find it understandable that if you know that you have a big audience and whatever you're going to write is going to affect a lot of people, are you really going to, in that sort of situation, push back? I understand that. But again, focus on the translation part and not so much on the messaging part. Question the messaging, the political messaging, and try to translate sort of the scientific debates. And I think, it's a hard thing to figure out, but it was not ideal early on in the pandemic.
But it's not too late to start now.
No, I mean, it's gotten much better, right? I mean, it's definitely gotten much better. This has been a super difficult. I mean, look, I started publicly talking and writing about COVID-19 in late February, I think. If I look back at the stuff that I said, I mean, it's look, it was all to my best knowledge, right? Here's what I think today on whatever, February 28th or something. That stuff is hard. I get that. But I think you should probably make that stuff is hard kind of part of the message, the central part of your message, right? Instead of pretending that the stuff is not hard and we do exactly know, hey, masks are not going to help you. You don't need to wear masks, right? It would have been better to say, look, this stuff is hard. We don't know. We don't have any clear evidence. So we do not exactly know where we stand on the mask question.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. Saying stuff like, I don't know. And that's okay, because we're still figuring things out. Yeah. And I have the next question, which just fits perfectly here. That is, what's your opinion on the current level of science literacy and its effects on how societies have reacted to this pandemic?
I honestly don't think that science literacy is the problem. I don't think that societies are, I don't know, too dumb, too uneducated, whatever, to understand what's going on. The problem is that in some countries more than others, and particularly so in the United States, science itself has become something that has basically, your attitude towards science is something that is now bound up in your political identity, right? If you are conservative, a Republican, you are basically told to and conditioned to question the science, right? But that's not a problem of science literacy. It's a problem of science itself and the academic institutions being sort of becoming part of this overarching political and cultural conflict that has divided the US in particular in two parts, right? It's not a problem of people not being educated enough. It's a problem of certain political and societal elites telling people that you should not listen to these people, you should not listen to those people. It's really I think it's not so much a bottom-up problem, people not being educated, people not being smart enough. It's a top-down problem in the sense that we have these overarching political conflicts, and they shape the way we look at science. It's not a literacy problem. It's a sort of a political conflict that's now shaping the way we look at science.
The next question is, in your talk, you focus on the idea of global solidarity. So how do you see the coronavirus impacting on the increasing trend of nationalism and populism, both in the short and long term?
Easy question.
Easy, yeah.
Look, again, I mean, if I'm sticking with the sort of hopeful theme, right?
Yes, please.
At least the hopeful note that I was ending on, then I would say there is a scenario. I'm not going to say it's super likely, but there is a scenario in which this sort of global crisis makes more and more people realize that shutting ourselves off from the rest of the world is just not going to work. It's just not going to work. And like maybe global solidarity is not even the right word, because it sounds like some altruistic feeling. Oh, I feel so connected to the rest of the world, right? I mean, look, if we could develop that, awesome, I'm all for that. But that's not even what I meant. What I meant was in the 1940s, what made that moment specific is that these people were convinced that regardless of how you feel about the rest of the world, the only way to protect yourself was to work hand in hand with the rest of the world, right? It was, again, like global solidarity born out of pure self-interest, right? And I think there is a scenario in which COVID-19, this sort of global challenge, can make us realize that we just need to get to a point where we can answer these global challenges with, we can find answers that are commensurate to the problem. That's basically what we're talking about here, right? Global challenges need global answers, right? And that has nothing to do with altruism. It's a form of self-protection, really, right? A form of sort of self-interest, basically. And I mean, again, also, I mean, if you look around, it's probably not a coincidence that some of the countries that are hit hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic and that are really messing up the response are currently led by these, you know, nationalist, populist. I don't like the term populist because mostly those are not populists. But anyway, populist, nationalist, what they really are is ethno-nationalists, right? The United States, Brazil, even Great Britain, all led by ethno-nationalist, right-wing reactionary factions. Well, at least that's what I would call them. And I mean, look, maybe there's a lesson to be learned here, that we can certainly say that these countries have not dealt particularly well with the pandemic. So maybe there is a lesson here.
I have another easy one.
Yeah.
It seems that each state has its own policy in order to probe its better, as Sweden's case, even if it means experimentation, as lives were just objects. What about our ethical world? How does the current pandemic give us a more nuanced understanding of the concept of global?
That's an excellent question. First off, I totally share the diagnosis. There's an interesting thing going on, right? In the COVID-19 discourse. It's not like we are not talking about what's going on in the rest of the world, right? The discourse is globalized in the sense that we are looking at what's going on in other countries, but it's not in a sense that we're trying to get to a point where we can cooperate globally or find ways to cooperate globally. It's more in the sense that we are constantly comparing our way of dealing with the pandemic with other ways of dealing with the pandemic, right? It's almost like I was part of a panel last night where someone said it's almost like COVID Olympics, right? So we're basically like, hey, who wins the COVID Olympics gold? And you know, Germany maybe, because we've been doing super well, right? That's not great, right? That's not super helpful. Even like, again, like Germany has certainly gotten through this so far pretty well, but like generally speaking, it's not great. Now, conceptions of the global, I think that is a super interesting question. As a historian, I would always look at a term like global and say, I'm not going to define what it means. I'm going to look how contemporaries defined the term, right? So when I say global and talk about the 1940s, it's not my understanding of global. I'm trying to understand what did people in the 1940s understand as global. And what I think is so interesting about the history of pandemics or of like, you know, global health or international health politics is that these border crossing epidemics, these pandemics have almost always acted as catalysts for, have almost transformed our understanding of global. The very sort of emergence of an understanding of the global that really encompassed more than Europe and North America, that really encompassed sort of the globe, right, as a geographical term, if you will, has really been pushed in the 1940s by these idea of like global threat from disease and that sort of stuff. So it wouldn't be the first time, and it would be an interesting, again, a chance maybe to reconceptualize our understanding of global and where in our own imagination of the term, and also in our own imagination of what part of the global deserve our attention and what parts of the globe we basically never spend much attention on, how we can maybe reconceptualize that. So again, like I'm not sure how hopeful I am, but you definitely see a lot of people talking about these issues right now, and not just like in like small academic circles, right? I mean, I can't be the only one who like has these discussions with like people who talk about like what kind of world do we want to live in? How can we deal with these global challenges?
Absolutely, yes. We have lots more questions, but not a lot of time left. So I think we have to wrap it up here. We will try to answer all other questions afterwards in the chat and on YouTube. Thank you again, Thomas. It was fascinating to hear talk. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you opening this whole lecture series. And thank you to everyone watching. We hope you enjoyed it. And next week we'll have two researchers talking about a crisis of value, stoic responses to the pandemic, which will of course not be as good as this one, but it will come close. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a nice evening or day wherever you are. And see you next week. Bye-bye.